Every night, a homeless woman refused warm shelter and chose to sleep on a cold bench instead. People thought she had lost hope until they discovered she was waiting for someone she had not seen for 20 years. But when that person finally appeared, the entire street was left speechless. Stay tuned because you are about to watch a beautiful story and find out what happened next. Hello family, welcome to Tales by King. Kindly subscribe to my YouTube channel for more beautiful stories. Thank you as you do so. Sit back, relax as we dive into the story. Every evening in the quiet city of Riverside, when the golden sunlight slowly faded behind rows of tall buildings, the streets became busy with people rushing home after a long day. Cars moved slowly through traffic. Office workers walked quickly with their bags and phones. Street vendors packed their small stalls. But in the middle of all that movement, there was one person who never seemed to move. At the corner of Maple Street, beside a small coffee shop with warm yellow lights in the window, an old wooden bench stood beneath a tall maple tree. And every single evening, a woman sat there. Her name was Margaret Hill. Most people did not know her name. To them, she was simply the homeless woman who sat on the bench. Margaret looked thin and tired. Her gray coat was old and worn, the fabric faded by many years of sun and rain. Her shoes were cracked at the sides, and the soles had grown thin from walking. Her hair, once a soft golden brown, was now mixed with strands of gray and tied loosely behind her head. Yet there was something unusual about Margaret. Even though her clothes were old and her life seemed difficult, her face carried a quiet calmness. She never shouted. She never begged. She never asked anyone for money. She simply sat quietly on that bench every evening, watching the street as if she were waiting for something important. Or someone. In her hands, she always held a small photograph. The photograph was old and slightly bent at the corners, but Margaret protected it carefully as if it were the most valuable thing she owned. Sometimes she looked down at it and smiled softly. Other times her eyes filled with tears. But she never let it go. Across the street, the owner of the coffee shop often noticed her. His name was Daniel Brooks, a kind man in his early 50s who had owned the small cafe for nearly 20 years. Daniel saw hundreds of people pass his shop every day. But Margaret was the only one who stayed. At first, he thought she would leave after a few days. Then a week passed. Then a month. Then another. Eventually, Margaret became part of the street itself, almost like the bench belonged to her. One evening, as Daniel locked the doors of his cafe after closing, a cold wind began blowing through the street. The air felt sharp, and people hurried home to escape the coming night. Daniel looked toward the bench. Margaret was still there, her thin blanket wrapped around her shoulders. Daniel sighed quietly. He walked across the street carrying a small paper bag. "Margaret," he called gently. Margaret lifted her head and smiled when she saw him. "Good evening, Daniel." Daniel handed her the bag. "Some sandwiches and tea," he said. "You need something warm." Margaret accepted the bag gratefully. "Thank you, Daniel. You're very kind." Daniel sat down beside her on the bench. For a moment, they both watched the quiet street. Then Daniel spoke. "You know, the shelter downtown still has empty beds tonight." Margaret remained silent. "It's warm there," Daniel continued. "You would have a proper meal. A clean bed." Margaret looked down at the photograph in her hands. Her fingers gently touched the picture. Daniel noticed it again. She always carried it. He had never asked about it before. But tonight, curiosity finally pushed him to speak. "Margaret, why do you stay here every night?" Margaret slowly raised her eyes. Her voice was soft and calm. "I'm waiting for someone." Daniel frowned slightly. "Waiting?" Margaret nodded. "Yes." Daniel looked around the empty street. "Who are you waiting for?" Margaret smiled gently, but did not answer right away. Instead, she looked down at the photograph again. Daniel leaned slightly closer. For a brief moment, he saw the picture clearly. It was a little boy. The boy looked about 5 years old. He had bright eyes and a big joyful smile. Margaret carefully held the photograph against her chest. Daniel spoke again. "Margaret, you can't keep sitting here forever. Margaret looked toward the end of the street, as if expecting someone to appear at any moment. Her voice was filled with quiet certainty. "He will come." Daniel shook his head slowly. "You sound very sure." Margaret nodded. "I am." The wind grew colder as night settled over the city. People disappeared into their homes. Street lights flickered on. Daniel stood up and sighed. "Well, if you change your mind, the cafe door is always open." Margaret smiled warmly. "Thank you, Daniel." Daniel walked back across the street and entered his cafe. But before closing the door, he looked outside one more time. Margaret was still sitting on the bench, holding the photograph, watching the street, waiting. Daniel quietly shook his head. He did not understand why someone would wait like that. But deep inside, he felt something strange. A feeling that Margaret was not simply waiting for someone. She was holding on to something far stronger. Hope. And somewhere in the distance, beyond the quiet streets of Riverside, a story that had been broken many years ago was slowly finding its way back. The next morning, the streets of Riverside slowly came alive again. Cars filled the roads. People hurried to work. The smell of fresh coffee drifted from Daniel's cafe as customers stepped in and out. But across the street, beneath the tall maple tree, the same wooden bench remained. And sitting on it was Margaret Hill. She had not moved much during the night. Her thin blanket was wrapped tightly around her shoulders, protecting her from the cold air that still lingered from the night before. In her hands, just as always, was the small photograph. Margaret stared at it quietly. Her fingers gently touched the face of the little boy in the picture. "Good morning, my little one," she whispered softly. No one heard her words except the quiet wind moving through the leaves. Across the street, Daniel Brooks stood behind the counter in his cafe. He noticed Margaret sitting outside again. As usual, he poured a cup of hot tea into a paper cup and walked outside. When he reached the bench, Margaret looked up and smiled. "Good morning, Daniel." Daniel handed her the cup. "You must be freezing out here." Margaret accepted it gratefully. "The tea smells wonderful." Daniel sat beside her again. He had been thinking about her words all night. "I still don't understand," he said gently. "Why stay here every day? Why not wait somewhere warm?" Margaret looked toward the street again. Her eyes were calm, but something deep inside them carried years of quiet pain. "This is the place," she said softly. Daniel frowned. "The place for what?" Margaret slowly looked down at the photograph again. Before she could answer, a young woman approached them. She carried a small bag and wore a bright blue jacket with the logo of the Riverside Community Support Center. Her name was Emily Carter. Emily had heard about Margaret from several people in the neighborhood. Some said Margaret was stubborn. Others said she was simply waiting for something impossible. But Emily believed every person had a story. So she had come to meet Margaret herself. Emily walked slowly toward the bench. "Good morning," she said kindly. Margaret and Daniel both looked up. Emily smiled warmly. "My name is Emily Carter. I work with the Community Support Center." Margaret nodded politely. "Nice to meet you, Emily." Emily sat down carefully on the other side of the bench. "I've heard about you," she said gently. Margaret looked slightly embarrassed. "Oh dear. I hope nothing bad." Emily smiled. "Not at all. People say you're very kind." Margaret laughed softly. "That's nice of them." Emily looked at Margaret's thin blanket and worn shoes. Her heart tightened. "Margaret, the shelter downtown has warm beds and meals. We also have doctors who can help you." Margaret listened quietly. Then, just like before, she shook her head gently. "I'm grateful for the offer. But I can't go." Emily looked confused. "Why not?" Margaret lifted the photograph slowly. "Because if I leave, he might come." Emily leaned closer. "Who?" Margaret showed her the picture. Emily carefully took it. It was an old photograph, slightly faded by time. A little boy stood in a small park, holding a red balloon. He had bright brown eyes and a joyful smile. He looked full of life. Emily looked up. "Is this your son?" Margaret nodded slowly. "Yes. His name is Michael." Emily studied the picture again. "He looks happy." Margaret smiled softly. He was the happiest little boy. Emily returned the photograph carefully. Where is he now? Margaret's smile slowly faded. Her eyes moved toward the street again. 20 years ago, she said quietly, there was an accident. Daniel and Emily both listened carefully. Margaret's voice trembled slightly as she continued. We were crossing a busy road. A truck lost control. Daniel's eyes widened. Margaret swallowed hard. I remember the loud sound. Then everything went dark. Emily leaned forward gently. What happened after that? Margaret looked down. When I woke up, I was in a hospital. Her fingers tightened around the photograph. But my son was gone. Emily felt her heart sink. You never found him? Margaret slowly shook her head. The police said he had been taken away by emergency workers. They told me he was safe. But after that, no one could tell me where he went. Emily felt tears forming in her eyes. That must have been unbearable. Margaret nodded. For years, I searched everywhere. Police stations, hospitals, children's homes. But she never found him. Daniel asked quietly, Then why wait here? Margaret gently touched the bench beneath her. Because before the accident, Michael made me a promise. Emily whispered softly, What promise? Margaret's voice became tender. When we used to visit this park, he loved sitting on this bench. He once told me something. She smiled through tears. He said if we ever got lost, we should come back here. And we would find each other again. Emily looked around the street. But that was 20 years ago. Margaret nodded calmly. Yes. Emily asked quietly. How long have you been sitting here? Margaret looked toward the end of the street again. Her eyes filled with quiet hope. Every day. For 20 years. Daniel was completely speechless. Emily wiped a tear from her cheek. She could not imagine that kind of patience. That kind of love. Margaret looked down at the photograph once more. Her voice was calm and certain. My son made a promise. And I believe he will keep it. Emily stared at her. At that moment, she realized something powerful. Margaret was not sitting on that bench because she had nowhere to go. She was sitting there because she believed in something. A promise. And sometimes, hope is the only home a broken heart has left. As the days passed, Maple Street continued its normal life. Cars rushed by every morning. Office workers walked quickly with coffee cups in their hands. Shop owners opened their stores and greeted customers. But now, more people had begun to notice Margaret Hill sitting on the wooden bench under the tall maple tree. For years she had been invisible to most people. Now her story had begun to spread quietly through the neighborhood. It started with Daniel Brooks, the cafe owner. After hearing Margaret's story, he could not stop thinking about it. A mother waiting 20 years for her son. It sounded impossible. Yet every time he looked through the cafe window, he saw Margaret sitting there with the same calm patience. And he realized something. She truly believed. Soon Daniel told a few regular customers about her. Then those customers told others. Within a few weeks, many people in the area knew about the woman who refused shelter because she was waiting for her lost son. Some people admired her faith. Others quietly felt sad for her. But no one could ignore her anymore. Every morning, Daniel brought her breakfast. Sometimes it was a warm sandwich. Sometimes just tea and bread. Margaret always thanked him with a gentle smile. You are very kind, Daniel, she would say. Daniel often shook his head. No, Margaret. You are the strong one. Margaret would laugh softly. I'm just a mother. Meanwhile, Emily Carter, the young social worker, could not forget the conversation she had with Margaret. That night she sat at her small desk in her apartment. Papers were spread everywhere. Her laptop screen glowed in the quiet room. Emily had decided to do something. She began searching. She searched through hospital records from 20 years ago. She looked at old police reports about accidents in Riverside. She checked missing child reports. But many records were old and incomplete. Some had been lost. Others had been transferred to different systems. Still, Emily did not give up. Every night after work, she continued searching. Because each time she remembered Margaret's words. My son made a promise. and I believe he will keep it. The more Emily thought about it, the more emotional it felt. What if the son was still alive? What if he had spent years searching too? One evening, as the sun began to set, dark clouds slowly covered the sky. Soon heavy rain started falling across Riverside. People ran for cover. Cars splashed water across the streets. Daniel stood at the cafe window watching the storm. Then he looked outside toward the bench. Margaret was still there. Rain fell heavily around her. Her blanket was soaked. Daniel immediately grabbed an umbrella and ran outside. "Margaret," he shouted. She looked up calmly. Daniel held the umbrella over her. "You can't stay here in this weather." Margaret's hair was wet, but she still smiled gently. "I'll be fine." Daniel shook his head. "This is not safe. Please come inside tonight." Margaret looked at the empty street through the rain. For a moment, Daniel thought she might finally agree. But then she shook her head again. "I can't leave." Daniel sighed in frustration. "Margaret, you've waited 20 years. What if he never comes?" Margaret slowly turned her eyes toward him. Her voice was quiet but strong. A mother never stops believing in her child. Daniel fell silent. He could not argue with that. So instead, he placed the umbrella in her hand. "At least take this." Margaret looked surprised. "You'll get wet walking back." Daniel smiled. "I'll survive." Margaret held the umbrella carefully. "Thank you." Daniel walked back toward the cafe through the rain. Inside the cafe, a few customers had watched the entire moment through the window. One of them whispered softly, "That woman must really love her son." Daniel nodded quietly. More than anything. Across the street, Margaret sat alone beneath the umbrella. The rain continued falling. Cars passed. Lights from buildings reflected on the wet road. Margaret looked down at the photograph again. Her fingers gently touched the smiling boy. "Michael," she whispered, "I'm still here. I promised I would wait." The rain slowly softened into a light drizzle. The city lights flickered warmly in the distance. And somewhere far away, a life that had been separated 20 years ago was quietly moving closer to the place where a mother still waited. 3 weeks passed. Every evening, Margaret Hill still sat on the same wooden bench on Maple Street, holding the small photograph close to her chest. The city continued moving around her as usual. Cars passed. People hurried home from work. Street lights flickered on when the sun disappeared behind the tall buildings. But Margaret's routine never changed. She sat quietly, watching the road, waiting. Across the street, Daniel Brooks often stood behind the window of his cafe and looked toward the bench. Even though he had heard her story many times now, he still felt something heavy in his heart every time he saw her there. Sometimes he wondered if the son she waited for was still alive. Sometimes he wondered if he would ever come. But Margaret never showed doubt. Her faith remained strong. Meanwhile, Emily Carter had not stopped searching. Every night after work, she sat at her desk surrounded by old records, files, and notes. She searched through accident reports from 20 years ago. She looked through hospital lists. She checked adoption records. At first, the search seemed impossible. Many documents were incomplete. Some files had been lost over the years. But Emily kept trying. One night, as she scrolled through another old record file, something suddenly caught her attention. Her eyes widened. There it was. A report about a child rescued during a traffic accident 20 years ago in Riverside. The boy had been taken to a hospital for observation. But because no relatives were found at the time, he was placed in temporary care. Later, he had been adopted. His original name had been listed as Michael Hill. Emily's heart began beating fast. She continued reading. After adoption, his name had been changed to Michael Carter. Emily quickly searched for that name. And within minutes, she found something remarkable. Michael Carter was now an architect living in another city. He had built a successful career. But according to a short interview article Emily found online, there was something strange about his past. The article mentioned that Michael had spent years trying to discover his biological family. Emily covered her mouth in shock. This could be him. Her hands trembled as she searched for his contact information. After a long moment, she finally found an email address connected to his company. Emily hesitated. Her heart raced. Then she typed a message. She explained everything. She told him about the accident, about the missing child, about the mother who had been waiting on a bench for 20 years. After sending the message, Emily sat back in her chair. She had no idea if he would respond. But the next morning, when Emily opened her email again, her breath caught in her throat. There was a reply. The message was short, very short. It simply said, "If what you are saying is true, I'm coming." That same afternoon, a black car slowly drove into Riverside. Inside the car sat a man in his early 30s. His name was Michael Carter. His hands gripped the steering wheel tightly. His mind was full of emotions. For years he had searched for answers about his childhood. He had grown up with kind adoptive parents who loved him deeply. But they had always been honest with him. They told him he had been rescued from an accident when he was very young. They did not know what happened to his real mother. As Michael grew older, he tried to search for her. But the records were incomplete. The trail had always ended in confusion. Until yesterday. Until Emily's message. Now Michael's heart was filled with hope. And fear. What if it wasn't true? What if he arrived and found nothing? But something deep inside him told him to keep driving. Soon the car turned onto Maple Street. Michael slowed the car. His heart pounded heavily in his chest. Then he saw it. The bench. Under the tall maple tree. And sitting on the bench was an elderly woman holding a photograph. Michael stopped the car. For a moment, he couldn't move. His hands trembled. He stepped out slowly. Across the street, Daniel and a few cafe customers noticed the car. They watched quietly as the young man walked toward Margaret. Margaret was staring down at the photograph again. She had not noticed him yet. Michael took a deep breath. Then he spoke. His voice was soft but trembling. "Mom." Margaret froze. Her fingers tightened around the photograph. Slowly, very slowly, she lifted her head. Her eyes met the young man standing in front of her. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Michael's eyes were already full of tears. "I've been looking for you for years," he said softly. Margaret stared at his face. Her heart began beating wildly. Something about him. The eyes. The voice. Her lips trembled. "Michael." The man nodded slowly. "Yes, Mom." The photograph slipped gently from Margaret's hands as tears filled her eyes. She stood up slowly, her body shaking. For 20 years she had imagined this moment. But now that it was happening, it almost felt unreal. Michael stepped closer. And suddenly Margaret rushed forward and wrapped her arms around him. She held him tightly, as if afraid he might disappear again. Michael hugged her back just as tightly, both of them crying. Across the street, Daniel covered his mouth in shock. Emily, who had just arrived, stood frozen with tears streaming down her face. After 20 long years, a promise made by a little boy had finally brought him back, to the place where his mother never stopped waiting. For a long moment, Margaret and Michael simply held each other. Neither of them wanted to let go. 20 years of pain, searching, and waiting poured out in silent tears as they stood beneath the tall maple tree on Maple Street. Margaret's hands gently touched Michael's face, as if she wanted to make sure he was truly real. "My son," she whispered softly. Michael smiled through tears. "Yes, Mom. It's me." Margaret shook her head slowly, still in disbelief. "I waited for you every day," she said. Michael's voice trembled. "And I searched for you everywhere." They sat down together on the wooden bench where Margaret had spent so many nights. Michael looked at the worn blanket beside her. His heart tightened. "You stayed here all this time?" he asked quietly. Margaret nodded. "This was our place." Michael looked around the street. He noticed the cafe across the road. Daniel stood outside watching them, his eyes still wet with emotion. Emily stood beside him, smiling softly. Michael turned back to Margaret. "I wish I had found you sooner," he said. Margaret gently held his hand. "Life sometimes takes long roads before bringing people back together." Michael smiled sadly. You never stopped believing I would come? Margaret looked at him with loving eyes. A mother never stops believing in her child. Michael lowered his head as tears rolled down his cheeks again. He had spent years building buildings and designing beautiful homes for others. Yet the one person who mattered most had been sitting on a simple wooden bench all this time, waiting for him. After a moment, Michael reached into his coat pocket and took out a small photograph. Margaret looked surprised. It was the same photograph she had been carrying for 20 years. Michael smiled softly. I kept the same picture, he said. Margaret gasped in amazement. You kept it too? Michael nodded. I carried it everywhere. Margaret placed her hand over his. For the first time in many years, the deep loneliness inside her heart began to disappear. Across the street, Daniel finally walked over to them. Well, he said gently, trying to hold back his tears. I guess this bench did its job. Margaret laughed softly. Yes, it did. Emily stepped closer as well. Michael turned toward her. You must be Emily, he said gratefully. Emily nodded. I only helped a little. Michael shook his head. You helped give me my mother back. Margaret reached for Emily's hand. Thank you for believing in my story, she said. Emily smiled warmly. Some promises are too strong to ignore. The evening sun began to set slowly behind the city buildings. Golden light filled Maple Street. For the first time in 20 years, Margaret stood up from the bench with a different feeling in her heart. Michael held her hand gently. Mom, he said softly, you don't have to sleep here anymore. Margaret looked at the bench for a moment. That simple wooden bench had been her home for 2 decades. It had witnessed her tears, her prayers, her hope. But now something beautiful had happened. Her waiting was finally over. Michael smiled warmly. I have a home, and now it has been missing someone important. Margaret looked at him. You mean me? Michael nodded. Yes, Mom. He helped her toward the car parked nearby. Daniel waved goodbye. Don't forget to visit us, he called out. Margaret laughed happily. I won't. Emily smiled as she watched them leave. The car slowly drove away from Maple Street. Margaret looked back through the window one last time. The bench stood quietly under the maple tree. For 20 years it had been a place of waiting. Now it became something else. A reminder. A reminder that hope is stronger than time. As the car drove through the glowing evening streets, Michael held his mother's hand. For the first time since he was a little boy, he felt whole again. And Margaret, who had once been known only as a homeless woman waiting on a bench, was now simply what she had always been, a mother, who never stopped believing that love would one day find its way home. That brings us to the end of this video. I hope you find this story worth watching. If you do, kindly subscribe to my YouTube channel for more beautiful stories, like, comment, and share this video to your friends and loved ones. Your support and engagement encourage me to post more videos. Thanks for watching.